thank you very much for having me here at your conference. It is very interesting, and as Lisa said, I didn't understand most of what happened in the first little bit, but I caught snippets of things, so I'm learning as I'm here. And so I think a little bit of our content might overlap when we're talking about this election, because it is new and the key issues were ones we were all observing at the same time. But in particular, I'm thinking a little bit more about party responses to digital threats. So how do parties themselves try to combat these threats that they're facing as they engage in elections? Just do this, right? All right. So how does cybersecurity connect with the study of parties? Well, data is a wonderful currency. It tells the story of us, how we behave. Businesses want it because it means they can nudge us into buying more. Political parties want it because it helps them learn about voters and how they might behave in terms of making choices on election day. So the ability to gather, store, merge data, it is a compelling one for capitalism and elections alike. But as you know, we live in a digital age, and we use digital sources to connect with each other, to get our news, and to make our lives more convenient and accessible. But the digital era also has consequences, and they've made our institutions and our political actors vulnerable in new ways. Digital technologies, as you know, can be weaponized in a way that threatens our democratic experiment, in particular that core piece of liberal democracy, which is free and fair elections. Chris Denove, who's from the postdoc, might not be postdoc anymore, at UBC, he and his co-authors wrote a great report using the security threat model as their model, and asked themselves, in terms of democracies, what do we value? What needs to be secured? Who are our adversaries? Where are the vulnerabilities? And what are the best countermeasures to combat these threats? And this matters because there's much that is valuable in the democratic process of choosing representatives. As Denove and others have pointed out, digital threats to campaigns and elections have a detrimental impact on fair participation in the electoral process. They can discourage citizens, especially women, especially visible minorities, from standing for office. They can damage what should be public debates about policy based on truthful information that are inclusive of all citizens. And they cause citizens to be less trustful of their institutions, including the integrity of the electoral process itself. And the main ways, as Lisa pointed out, are of course hacking, right, into servers themselves to gather information for the purpose of leaking information to damage the election, to damage candidates, to damage parties. Hacking for the purpose of fabricating results. This is what we of course saw in Ukraine in 2014, where they narrowly missed a fabrication of the results of the election. Disinformation, and we do live in increasingly polarized societies, and planting disinformation is a great way to make us move to further extremes. We do this through, of course, false news stories, tweets, memes, altered video and audio, and the malice in it all, of course, of these bots. And finally, trolling, I think, for the purpose of what we're looking at. That's harassment online, right? Particularly hateful language, usually aimed at female candidates who are visible minorities, LGBTQ, and that's for the purpose of suppressing people from wanting to stand for office. We've also had instances where female candidates in particular have stepped down from running because they've had threats to their own physical safety or the safety of their family. So, are digital threats a problem? Well, yes, they're clearly a problem. And we've seen this as written about by scholars and journalists alike about foreign interference in elections via digital means. And Lisa's already talked about the policy preparations from the Government of Canada. And so just top level, and I'm basically, I'm glad we're on the same page here, Lisa. But on the face of it, I think we got through relatively unscathed in this past federal election. The number of bots on Twitter was low. All right, so initially in the first part of the campaign, and we were going to get information from those who were specifically studying Twitter later on, but it looked like it was about 5% at the beginning, so very low. No reports of intrusions into the digital services of the main parties. There was no instances of cyber threats against the balloting system itself. And as Lisa noted, disinformation was out there, but certainly not to the same degree as elections elsewhere. We did see trolling of female candidates, and I don't know if anybody here is aware of Parity Bot, if you saw that on Twitter. It was one sort of a response to trolling of women in the campaign. I'll just talk about that briefly at the end. So I was interested in observing what the political parties would do. They are integral to the operation of democracy and of, providing choice to Canadians and other citizens around the world in their countries. But they definitely operate in different legal and regulatory contexts from country to country. And so I sort of did a scan of what has happened in other countries as well as what happened in Canada. And as Lisa also set out, parties in Canada are, for the most part, private organizations that have to follow very strict campaign finance rules about raising and spending money in an election, but otherwise are pretty much left to their own devices. And as noted, they're vulnerable. They do collect data. They have databases. They give a variety of people access to that data, campaign staffers, volunteers, etc. And in most parts of the country, they're not subject to any privacy legislation. I mean, the challenge with the data that our parties have is that we don't really know what it is that they have. We know at Elections Canada, we know they get the registry of voters. They have a good idea of their own supporters. They know who've donated. They know information from volunteers that go door to door, and they hear what you might have a concern about, and they'll make a note on that. Certainly research done in the United States. We always think that parties have like crazy amounts of information. But Eaton Hirsch has actually done some great work in the US, and he's noted too that most of the data is public data. So we need to watch what governments make public in terms of their data, because that's the kind of thing that parties can also access. So my questions though, how have parties responded to digital threats in their campaigns, and what has been the effectiveness? Like if they are left on their own, what do we see? And so, because this is security studies and they make all these typologies, I decided to create a typology based on my observations and analysis, although I think I'm going to make them into hockey terms, just using from the speaker before, because I think that's a great idea. But what we see is that parties around the world are responding differently to digital threats. And sometimes it depends on whether they're compelled to act or not. Most parties are kind of on their own on this. So the first one that we see, and this also depends on how the response of parties also depends on their level, their expectation of something happening, whether they actually are attacked, did they have a response prepared, how high risk is that particular response. So we've got these 6 that I've put together here. The first one is called the offensive defense. And the great example here is Macron's campaign in France, if you've read about that, which I'm sure most of you have. There was a high expectation after the 2016 US election that other elections would have to deal with foreign interference. And Macron's campaign prepared for it. I think they just expected, there was a high expectation that they would be targeted. And Macron's campaign team they kind of leveled up their game when it came to these particular digital threats. They actually trained all of their campaign staff weekly on how to identify phishing emails and that sort of thing, right? So everybody was trained constantly, this is what it's going to look like. And of course the phishing emails came in, and then Macron's campaign responded to all of the phishing emails, giving passwords and logins that were incorrect, right? So they just replied and gave all kinds of information that wasn't right. They would have sort of faked documents in with their own documents. And so they basically, I guess it's in security, cybersecurity, it's like they hack the hackers. That's what I think that's the expression you guys would use. But in terms of a party and campaign, so that's high risk for a campaign to do that. And of course, we do know they dumped a bunch of leaked documents that they did get from that campaign, but it was right before a 2-day blackout in France. They have a 2-day blackout before their balloting, and the media was primed and was told to be very careful with whatever information might be dumped at any point in the campaign. And then the Macron team made it clear, we were hacked, but by the way, there's, we were prepared for it. So there's information in here that's not true information. So the offensive defense, I think you got to be a pretty special campaign team to pull that one off. Then you've got the allied cooperative defense, high expectation of attack, your response is prepared, it's a little more preemptive because you've had to sort of cooperate, and it's a bit lower risk. So this is what Angela Merkel and Scholz did in Germany. Again, 2017, high expectation that there would be some kind of foreign interference. And what the major parties did is they struck what is called, a gentleman's agreement. And the parties agreed that they'd go into that campaign, and if at any point there was leaked documents about any one of the leaders or their parties, the other parties would not seize on it and use it to propel their own campaigns, because that's part of the purpose of a leak. You want your competition or your opponent to pick up on it and use it to propel you into power. Again, special, I don't know if we can have all of our parties agree to this sort of thing in advance, but it certainly was a type of response. The third-party reliance defense or response, this is certainly something that our parties depend on. This is when you rely on organizations such as journalists, news media, or other groups to respond to digital threats. So we have, one example in our campaign, and again, as Lisa pointed out, this was a domestic. This is parties sort of doing themselves, but Andrew Scheer's campaign tweeted out that the RCMP were investigating Trudeau on the SNC-Lavalin, right? So I think his director of comms tweeted that out. Andrew Scheer sort of tweeted again that allegation, and the RCMP clarified in a statement that they were not commenting on anything like that, and killed it, and they had to delete the tweets. So the Liberal Party decided not to respond, but they relied on a third-party organization, and the RCMP helped them with that particular misinformation or disinformation. In our election, Facebook and Twitter were part of this third-party defense. Because of the new regulations, they got on board, they posted their ad registries, they deleted accounts that were fake accounts or determined to be bots. The parties relied on those two big corporations to do that work and help protect them as well. And of course, we have our security agencies also as a third party. So of course, the new protocol in Canada is to provide key members of the campaign team with a security briefing. And I still have to find out through interviews how those went and how that happened. There could be people in the room that know much more about that than I do, but also relying on the security agencies to give high-level briefings about any threats that were coming out. The last three, direct response, not a big deal. All parties do that. That's where parties will just directly respond if there's misinformation. Again, it's domestic, so there was twisting policy around suggesting there'd be a 50% housing tax for some liberal proposal, and the parties responded with an ad on their own and a Twitter war about that. And then the last couple, so back to basics defense. Certainly Australia political parties are doing this, and we see the US Democratic Party. This is where you have an expectations, you're prepared, there might not, no attack is necessary, very low risk. From what I understand, in the US, the Democratic Party is getting help from the FBI and Homeland Security, letting their servers be white hat hacked to make sure that they are secure and no longer vulnerable. In Australia, when the political parties were hacked into early in this year, the Australia Cybersecurity Agency lent their experts and expertise to the parties to help them try to up their game in terms of security. Finally, the neutralizer defense, and I'll end on this. This is where we try to neutralize one of those risks. And as I'll end with the Parity Bot. This was a third-party organization based in Edmonton that developed a servant bot, I guess is what they're called. And Parity Bot basically they programmed into that algorithm for that particular Twitter bot all the female candidates from all the parties who were running. And whenever that bot detected any hateful language, racist, sexist, any threats of assault, it would just send out a positive tweet. And they crowdsourced the positive tweets, but every time any female candidate ended up with something hateful in her feed, the Parity Bot would start to just pump out positive tweets. And in the middle of the campaign, I asked, the organizers of that, the creators of that particular bot, so where are we at? And they had listed the top 10 women. Number 1 was Catherine McKenna. Number 2 was Elizabeth May, so that details the polarization in the pipeline politics. They received, Catherine McKenna was at something like 25,000 tweets with hateful language. And the number 10 was Hetty Fry, and she had like 2,500. So it was interesting that the most abused candidate had 10 times more abusive tweets than the least abused candidate. But I think parties could adopt something like this to help inoculate their own candidates and help encourage more women to run. Anyway, I will end on that because I'm definitely at my time, and thank you very much.